Okay, everyone, thank you all so much for joining today's KETIV Virtual Academy session. My name is Christina Ung. I'm with the marketing team, so I help put these sessions together. Today, we're going to be joined by Tom Fitzgerald. This is part 4 of our data management implementation series. Today, we'll focus on configuration. If this is your first KETIV Virtual Academy session, welcome. We hope that you gained something from today's session. And if you are a returning learner, welcome back. I wanted to drop an asset that we have here, 5 data management best practices that you guys can check out if you would like more support. And you can always reach out to us if you'd like more support with your data management journey. If you have any questions during the session, please submit them via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to address them. And all of these sessions are recorded and posted on our website as well as on our YouTube channel. And finally, I would like to invite you to our Manufacturing Leaders Exchange. We have a few sessions coming up. I believe our next one is going to be in March in San Jose. So if you're around the San Jose area, this is an in-person session for manufacturing leaders and innovators to join together and discuss trends, successes, failures, and how we can move forward in the workplace. This is just a casual happy hour event that everyone is welcome to join in on. We also have a few that are going to be virtual if you're not in the San Jose area. So you can scan this with your phone, scan this QR code and register. You can also check it out on our website.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's KVA, where we're going to be talking about data management implementation. This is a continuing series that we have here. Today, we're going to be focusing on configuring our data management installation. So thank you once again for everybody for showing up and continuing on this conversation with me. My name is Tom Fitzgerald. You all may know me. I'm a Senior Technical Solutions Executive here at KETIV. Been here for 2 years. Prior to that, I was at Autodesk for 10 years as a solution architect, a number of different consultant type of positions. I've been working within the 3D design space for 25 plus years and really engaged with manufacturing in one capacity or another for the last 30 plus years. I'm a US Army veteran, and in my free time, I like to study World War II history. So that's enough about me. Today, like I said, we're going to be talking about configuration. In our previous episodes, we talked about how to go about and some of the things that you want to learn about or know about in terms of planning your data management implementation. After that, we started talking about preparation. How do we prepare our environment? How do we install the software? What do we need to understand around our data and its current state in relative to how we may want to utilize or leverage that information going forward? Okay, so now we want to get into, well, what do we do about configuring the system? How do we configure the system, rather, in order for us to be able to utilize our data the best that we can? The whole point of having a data management application, right? So let's talk a little bit about some of these other episodes, just real quick here. KETIV, we've been around for a long time, and we really focus on putting together and partnering with companies that provide different technologies, different capabilities, different functionality that we can put together to support our manufacturing companies, right? Our customers. So we focus on things within the sales and automation configuration space, over into CAD and engineering and design, into simulation and testing, and ultimately out to manufacturing. One of the things that I really want to point out on this particular slide is how data management spans and works within all of those different spaces. It's like this common thread that goes through all of these different spaces. Anybody who does anything relative to sales or engineering or simulation or manufacturing, they're either going to be creating, modifying, or consuming data. So having a system in place to be able to facilitate and support that activity is going to be critical for you as a company to store, maintain, preserve, and secure your intellectual property. So that's really the focus of this slide right here. In order for us to understand how do we get from where we are to where we want to be, one of the things that we need to understand is where do we as a company reside within our technology maturity? along this matrix of level 1, level 2, level 3, and ultimately optimize at level 4. Where are we? Understanding where you are within this matrix will then allow you to understand the steps that are necessary for you to proceed up the ladder, if you will, of integrating other systems, buying new technology, supporting and training individuals in order for them to be more productive, whatever the case might be. Really understanding and aligning yourself as a company to this technology maturity is going to give you that insight necessary for you to take the steps going forward. The digital pipeline diagram, I love this slide simply because as we're talking about you as a company, you have your sales engineers, your estimating, you have your drafting, design, engineering, you have your manufacturing. Once again, all of them have different needs and requirements around data. And in this case, Autodesk Vault, that is that PDM, that data management solution that spans across all of those different silos. It is the backbone to manufacturing in a lot of different instances, okay? So what we're going to be talking about today, very specific to your data management application configuration. What should we be looking at? Well, we have to understand, number one, how do we operate? How do we currently consume, create, store? How do we use that data? What is our workflow of how that data is utilized within our particular organization? So analyzing your workflows. How is information being created? How is it being consumed? Who has dependencies on that from a workflow perspective? We also want to touch on naming conventions. How are we naming files? How are we naming attributes? How are we naming properties? How are we naming categories? How are we naming anything inside or outside of our system, so that way we can easily identify it and ensure that we're reducing the amount of duplication and replication as possible, okay? We want to touch on the different properties and attributes that we want to utilize within our system. Every file, as you know, has multiple bits of information called metadata: file name, file size, who created it, where is it stored. There's all sorts of other additional characteristics you can tie to your files in order to easily identify them, as well as use them as containers, if you will, of specific information that needs to be used within our entire business pipeline, okay? More specifically to the data and how it relates to the data management application like Vault, we want to focus on how are we going to be categorizing information as information is being created, edited, and then finally released towards for production. What kind of life cycle does that follow? And what do we need to be worried about and concerned about and aware of in order to be able to understand that information relative to the data management application? And the last one on that bullet point is, how do we revise information? What if changes need to be made? How do we accommodate that change? And the last thing is our security model. Who can access information? What can they see? What capabilities do they have within the system relative to the role they play within the organization? Okay, so we're going to be focusing on these things in our conversation today. So one of the first things that we want to understand is, how do we currently operate? What is our workflow when it comes to the information that we ultimately want to store within our data management application? Okay, so how do we configure the system to support our workflow? Well, we need to understand what information is coming into engineering most specifically. Now, this can also be what information is coming into the sales engineers, or information that is going into manufacturing. But we want to focus primarily on engineering right now, because they create a lot of that information that's going to be within our data management application, our solution. So what inputs come into engineering that we need to utilize? How are we managing and storing that information so we can reference it? Likewise, what information is engineering responsible to output to manufacturing? So how are there dependencies on the things upstream as well as what's going on downstream? Okay. What systems are we dependent upon? Do we have an ERP that we have to interface with in order to pass information down to our files that we need to consume? Things like vendor information, inventory, pricing, things along those lines that might be variables, might change on a regular basis, but maybe engineering isn't responsible for maintaining that information. So there may be another system out there that other individuals are responsible for engaging and interacting with that update information that we then need to consume in engineering. So what kind of system do we need to be dependent upon or rely upon in order to get that information to maintain that digital pipeline? What about internal and external access relative to the workflow? Do we rely on external individuals, contract workers, remote workers to contribute to a design or the workflow? How are we going to give them access to that information? Do they VPN? Do they VPN in? Do they use a thin client? Do they have a different access point in order to consume that information or contribute to that information? And then what kind of interoperability do we have with these systems? Now, I've identified, a dependency upon a system, but how do we interoperate with that system? What information needs to come out of the ERP to the PDM? What information is engineering responsible for creating that needs to be passed to another system? So not only what are we dependent upon, but what information specifically needs to be transferred or synchronized? So what kind of interoperability do we have there? And then I challenge you to ask yourself this question is, why do we do the things that we do today? Is it simply because this is the way we've always done it? Is there limitations with different systems and services that we currently have that are dictating the way that we define our workflows? Why are we doing it this way? What can change? What should change? And what are we not even exploring that perhaps other companies are doing, or other experiences that consultancy services like KETIV could provide you in terms of being able to shed light upon different options that you never even really knew you had available? Okay, so you should always be asking yourself things along those lines relative to your workflow. Now, the reason why we're focusing on understanding workflow, do you have it diagrammed out? Do you have it standardized? Is there documentation to support, that workflow? Having that information readily available is going to be imperative in order for us to go on to the next steps here, okay? So through that process of analyzing your workflows, one of the things that you should be focusing on is naming conventions, okay? So how are we naming things? Is there a smart numbering system that we're dependent upon? I've seen plenty of companies that have, like, say, a 10-character file name that they provide where the first 2 characters denote something about maybe its category, and the second 2 characters define its material, and the third 2 characters define a process of how it's created. Whatever the case might be, there are mechanisms out there and methodology that companies have put into place to define what that smart numbering system might be. Is this something that you want to continue doing? You should always ask yourself that as well. What about sequential numbering? There's a lot of companies out there that they're not so dependent upon the name so much as they're concerned about reducing redundancy and duplication. So having a uniquely identifiable number in a sequential type of pattern is more important to them than understanding by looking at its file name, what is this file all about? There's other things that we can rely upon, like, say, properties and attributes that can provide some of that characteristic information that we need, as opposed to relying upon a smart part numbering system in order to provide that, okay? When it comes to naming convention, what about, we talked about files, but what about folders? Is there a specific naming convention you want to apply to folders? What about properties, parameters, dimensional parameters within our CAD files? What about different features within our designs? Is there a specific naming convention that we should be implementing and adhering to facilitate a process of being able to easily recognize specific important information? Okay. And then, of course, we always want to understand, well, what are the business needs around naming conventions? You may have multiple business units within your organization. Some business units have specific needs where others don't. A great example of this is business acquisition. I've seen this a lot of times where there's like a parent company and they go and they purchase a lot of other companies. And as opposed to enforcing some sort of unification throughout those business units, each one of those business units is a little independent from one another. They have their own naming convention. They have their own needs. They have their own stock numbering system. Whatever that case might be, is understanding what those business needs might be in order to define a convention that you want to follow. Okay. So let's just talk about naming conventions a little bit more in the context of the data management application. So I'm going to go over here to Vault real quick, Autodesk Vault. And I'm just going to kind of look over when I'm talking about naming convention, and this is why it's important, is because I may have a naming convention here for my folders that are very arbitrary, or maybe they need to be descriptive, but they don't necessarily have to be, because what I can do here within this application is, as I select on different folders over here, not files, but folders, I get specific property information about that folder over here on the right-hand side. So in one of the previous episodes, we talked about is understanding the strengths of the data management application that you're going to be looking at. Okay. So if there's a particular strength within Vault where I can rely upon property information to be descriptive enough about the folder, then maybe I don't need to have a very descriptive folder name, right? Maybe this could be a little bit more generic, and then I can rely upon some property information to kind of further express or explain what this folder does, or the information that might be in it. Similarly, with files, we have property information as well. We don't have to have very descriptive file names. We can use the property information for us to be able to identify and isolate information based upon those characteristics. Even our properties, right? So we have some system properties that we can't change the names of, but we also have some user-defined properties or custom properties that are specific to you as a company. What do you want to call these properties? Do they need to be descriptive, right? In terms of the name. So there's a lot of different things that we have to name within our systems in order for us to be able to identify them. So putting some time towards a naming convention that makes sense for all of these files, folders, properties, parameters, features. You may have different schemes, right, that you want to rely upon for each and every one of those. But actually taking the time to address that is what's going to be important. Okay. When it comes to configuring properties and attributes, some of the things that we want to pay attention to is listed here as these bullet points. And the reason why this is important and deserves attention all by itself is because inside the context of Vault here, our data management application, properties are everything. Properties are everything in terms of being able to find information that I need. I can look for very specific properties. Say, for instance, I want to know what its stock number is, or its title, or the date something might have been created. Without having these properties, number one, in place, and number two, populated, we're not going to be able to find the information when we need it with the confidence that it's going to be accurate. Okay. So focusing on what properties are needed what properties do we need to apply to different files so that way we can engage and interact with that information a lot easier, okay? When it comes to properties and attributes, that's why we need to focus on these things. They're nothing more than characteristics of files. Like I said before, it could be CAD data, maybe there's material, maybe there's some dimensional information we want to capture within properties. This lends itself to being able to search for files faster and be able to find the information that we need when we need it with the confidence that it's accurate. Also, there's a lot of, we talked about previously, particularly within configuration, the configuration episode, but interacting and interoperating with other systems. A lot of times property information is what's being passed, right? If we take in the example of vendor information, what vendor has a name, they have an address. Typically, there's other information about the vendor that we need to be aware of. If that information is being stored in a CRM or an ERP system, but we need to capture some of that, we need to make sure that we're understanding of that within our data management application. So that way, if we have to interact or interop with those systems, that we're understanding what those property names are and those attributes. So that way we're synchronizing that information and passing that information appropriately, okay? So the systems that we interop with could also dictate the types of properties that we have, the names of those properties, and how we're leveraging those properties. And then ultimately, BOM documentation. I mean, this is a big bullet point to take into consideration as well. In some instances, a bill of material can be generated from your PDM. In a lot of cases, it's not. Either it's being generated from your ERP system, perhaps even a PLM, right? So there's other systems that could be generating that bill of material. However, having your PDM set up where it understands and it can synchronize with some of these systems, engineering information is going to be critical for that BOM. Maybe engineering information doesn't entail all that's involved with a BOM, but there's a lot of information that comes out of engineering that is going to be involved in that BOM. So understanding what that BOM should look like from another system, how does that correlate and correspond to our PDM and engineering, and make sure that that is set up so that way we're facilitating that process the best we possibly can. Okay. When it comes to configuring our PDM specifically with Autodesk Vault, we want to take really close look at these three items here: categories, life cycles, and revision management. Okay. So first, let's talk about categories. What are categories? Why should we be concerned about categorization? Well, it's a feature and functionality within Vault, and I'm sure it's in other PDMs as well. But categorization allows us to organize files based upon their types and primarily how those files are being used. And ultimately, a file is nothing more than a container of information, right? So how should we be organizing our containers, and how do we use that information for other things, either upstream, downstream, interoperating with other systems? How do we consume them within our processes? What kind of information those people that need to interact with those files, what kind of information they need to see? So categorizing that information allows us to then work with life cycles and revision management a little bit easier. So I'll get back to life cycles and revision management. Let's look at categories within Autodesk Vault real quick, okay? And why this is important. So if I go into my administrative environment here, you're going to notice that we have these things identified right here: naming conventions, property information, categorization, and then of course, lastly is what kind of life cycle does this information follow? How do we ensure that it gets released for production appropriately? And then of course, how do we then revise it so we're keeping history, keeping track of those changes that are being made, okay? So categorization is very important in this process because we can create many different categories for our information that we can then tie life cycles, revisions, and properties to. So why is this important? Well, If we think about administrative information, like say a Word doc that identifies some information maybe about material, okay? That information is going to follow a different path to be approved and leveraged than say a complex design on some sort of mechanical feature that has to adhere to some sort of specification, right? So we're going to have a lot of different parts that make up an assembly. They're going to be made out of different material. They need to interface and interact with each other. You know, we got to go through the process of idealizing, coming up with the idea of that design first. Then we got to conceptualize it. Then we actually have to put it work in progress so that way we can collaborate to develop that design. Then somebody has to check it. Somebody has to approve it. And then finally, it's going to get released. So it's a lot more complicated to initiate that process of creating information to ultimately get approved, as opposed to that administrative document that kind of just lists out specification information, okay? So by understanding the different categories of information, we can then start understanding, well, what kind of life cycle does it need to follow? What kind of revision process does it follow? And then what kind of information needs to be tied to it? So that way we can visualize and identify that information a lot easier, okay? So this is why categories are important. And just mind you, these are some out-of-the-box categories. We can create as many as we want, name them what we want, so on and so forth. So totally customizable. The point of the conversation is categories are absolutely positively imperative. And that's because once your files are categorized, once you have this set up within the system, then we can start applying life cycles to it in terms of, what kind of flow does it follow? Is it a simple one? Is it a longer one? Who has access to it? What kind of transitions does it follow? We can be very definitive in terms of this is information that's inside of the vault. This is how the process it needs to follow in order for us to get it approved. This is who needs to see it, who needs to approve it, who needs to interact with it, so on and so forth. Similarly, with our revisions, we can define many different revision schemes, alphanumeric, and those get tied to categories as well. Once again, an administrative document that kind of specifies the material probably goes through a different bit of a revision process than something that's a little bit more complicated and complex that ties directly to our intellectual property, okay? So going back over here to our PowerPoint here. So this is why categories are extremely important, right? Identifying the types of files and how those files are being used. Our life cycles really have to do with file management. What process do we follow to initially create some information to the point where it finally gets released so it can be consumed, right? Who has authorization? Who has authority over that? Who needs to check files? Who needs to approve files? Who needs to release those files? What kind of security is involved with those? Do the people that check the files, can they also edit those files? Or is it a read-only type of role? Understanding, how people are interacting with that information is going to directly correlate to how we define our life cycles as well. Understanding our revision management process. What is our process for change? What kind of steps are involved? Do we have very specific intellectual property control needs? Is there different standards and different authorities that are involved in terms of understanding our information and controlling and standardizing our information? Do we need to adhere to any of those specifications? What are we doing in terms of legacy information or when we have to archive information? Are we accommodating that within our revision management? Once something gets at the end of its life cycle, do we have an archival life cycle state for that? Is there something that we do in terms of our revision management where we archive that and it's no longer made available? So we got to take all these different things into consideration to properly configure our system to accommodate that, okay? So that's the whole point here of getting into naming conventions, properties, attributes, and then these items, categories, life cycles, revision management. We're building that picture of understanding what our system needs to look at. So that way, when we get into the later steps of our implementation, that groundwork is already laid out. That foundation is already set. It's already stable. It's ready to be used, okay? So the last thing to talk about here when it comes to configuration is the security model, right? So we have all our folders set up. We understand how our information is being used. We have some categories, some life cycles, some revisions, some naming convention. We have all that set up. We have a good understanding of what that looks like. One of the last things that we need to look at is how are people going to be accessing this information? How are they going to be leveraging this information? So we got to be aware as to how administrators work with the system and work with the data. What kind of role and permissions do they need? We have to understand, are there any power users? So typically power users are those subject matter experts, those that are have a lot of knowledge around different products. A lot of times they play a supporting role to the administrators, right? Then we also have our engineering and non-engineering users. So non-administrators, non-power users. We have engineering users, typically, lower level individuals that just need to get into your PDM to consume information or find information or review information, right? Non-engineering users, administrative people. Maybe they're not constantly contributing to the system, but they need to consume information from the system. Maybe they need to review some of those specification documents. How are we addressing their security? Do they only get read-only access, or do they have read-write options as well? You have to also be aware of your external users. Who's on the outside of the firewall that needs to get in to start looking at information? Are they adding information? Are they removing information, modifying information? What are their roles? If you have multiple business units, right? So I've seen a lot of systems where there's a parent company and there's multiple business units. Each one of those business units have their own PDM. Do they need to be talking to one another? Is there a configuration methodology being used in one business unit that could be directly applied to others to provide some consistency if needed, right? How are you sharing that data between those different business units or anyone in general, external vendors, external users, internal information, sharing information outside of the system itself? Do you have a cloud repository that you're putting information up? Are you using another system altogether to collaborate externally? How are you sharing that information? And then lastly is your intellectual property control, right? Your security model should be focused on not only the user experience of being able to create, manipulate, and consume information, but what about your intellectual property? So how are you ensuring that that is being secured, not just within the system, but even outside the system? So think about, even disaster recovery along those lines as well, okay? But your security model within your PDM needs to address all of these different elements in terms of the different types of roles and people that need to engage with the system, okay? So in summary, thinking about the configuration of our environment, we've already gone through the planning stages. We've diagrammed and documented what we want our design or our data management solution to look like. We've done some preparation in terms of identifying, what we need to do in terms of a hardware, software licensing situation to ensure that we have the system in place to support that planning, that whatever we planned out. And now we're at the point where we're really in the software, we're configuring it, we're tailoring it to our needs, because the next steps are getting it to a point where it's actually going to be usable, right? So things that we want you to be aware of when it comes to developing your configurations is they can be modified. And what do I mean by that? So anything within the system in terms of categories, life cycles, naming conventions, properties, those can all be changed later on. Yes, you want to go through an extensive planning exercise. Try to understand as much as you possibly can. Yes, you want to document that out, but also have peace in mind that later on, if you miss something or something needs to be changed because of something that you didn't understand, you can change the configuration. You don't have to have everything set in stone up front and then deal with it later on. You can, go with your best guess, get as much information as you can, develop the configuration, and go back and modify it as necessary as you learn more about how you're going to be able to use that system. It's always a good idea to start simple and then add complexity as necessary. And Autodesk Vault is perfectly capable of doing that. As a matter of fact, within the Autodesk Vault application here, I've seen plenty of customers that use Vault simply as a repository. They have very simplistic folder structure. They have a very simplistic security model. They don't really rely upon too many properties. That's fine. You can start off using Vault out of the box the way it is. Become familiar with it. And as you need more functionality, you can start creating more categories, changing those categories, adding more life cycles, adding additional features to then support how you want to work more effectively within your environment, okay? So start out simple, add complexity as necessary. You don't have to boil the ocean. You don't have to do everything at once, right? Take it in steps, digestible chunks rather, okay? You want to gather as much role input as you possibly can. This is going to be critical for configuring your environment appropriately. Take into consideration your admins, your power users, your general users, your non-engineering users, your external users. What other business units need to access that information? Start gathering as much input as you can from those different roles. Me personally, I find diagramming and illustrating to be extremely important here, because as you start building out your system, as you start building out your environment, you want to be able to have some sort of documentation that can capture that, okay? Don't rely upon your memory. Don't rely upon the memory of other people. Use tools in order to make that process easier. Document as much as you possibly can. And then, of course, use your test environment. In our last episode, we talked about installation and creating that test environment. Go ahead, ideate some things, come up with some thoughts as to how you want the environment to be. Throw that in your test environment, do some testing, refine that process, and then start understanding how you want to apply that to your production environment. And the last bullet point, I'm going to reiterate this one, is, set reasonable expectations. And what this means is do as much homework as you possibly can and be transparent and communicate that as well as you can. In a lot of cases, these implementations can be time consuming, depending on your situation and the size of your company and the things that you want to do. They can be expensive as well. Don't underestimate what you're getting yourself into, and set those proper expectations, because that's what's ultimately going to allow you to be as successful as you possibly can. So right now I'd like to open it up for any Q&A, but if you have any questions about the configuration of your different system, now is the opportunity, now is the chance for you to ask those questions. So thank you again for joining this KVA.